Today in the EU, why the EU won't stop the development aid decline. Amid the battery of executive orders that Trump issued on Inauguration Day, one could have long-lasting consequences. The US has paused all American foreign development aid for 90 days. That means that tens of billions of dollars in funds are now unavailable, leaving NGOs scrambling to quickly diversify donors. Sources tell us that EU top diplomat Kaja Kallas asked for a briefing to assess the risks the organizations face and the political stability of the countries they operate in. But Brussels has so far been clear it will not step up its own development funding. In fact, several member states already budgeted to cut it down this year. So what does this sudden freeze mean for aid workers around the world? And what's the EU's place in this new realist world order? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. Yep, it's time for another recap that involves Donald Trump. The American president announced on January 20th he would freeze all funding to the Agency for International Development, called USAID, and to foreign aid. In a matter of 4 days, NGOs worldwide saw financing stop coming in. And also, all overseas staff from USAID was put on leave. This means that about 10,000 personnel are now in limbo, figuring out whether to go back to the US or stay where they're posted. And from now on, any new funding will have to go through strict scrutiny of Trump's new State Secretary, Marco Rubio, tasked to assess whether NGOs' missions fit the purpose to make America great again.
The goal of our endeavor has always been to identify programs that work and continue them, and to identify programs that are not aligned with our national interests and identify those and address them. So we have sent out guidance to those deployed abroad that they will be on leave of absence, not fired, leave of absence as of Friday.
I'm here with Hilde Demen, Executive Director of Search for Common Ground, to see what the impact of all this looks like in the field. Hello, Hilde, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us, and thanks for inviting us to talk about this.
So your organization, Search for Common Ground, has activities in 35 countries, including conflict-affected areas like Gaza. The situation is dire. We have cases where essential staff has had to leave because of the inaccessibility to funding. Is that something that you are experiencing at Search for Common Ground as well? And how are your operations on the ground going?
For organizations like Search for Common Ground, we're very active in the peace-building field. We get funding through USAID, but we also get funding through the State Department, right? Mm-hmm. Lots of our programs around women inclusion or youth participation, religious engagement actually come from State Department, and all of that is also put on hold. And everything from one day to another, we've had to put an absolute brake on everything we do. We do not necessarily have to pull out staff because all our staff are nationals in most places where we work, but we've had to put them on temporary leave almost from one day to another. Of course, the immediate impact of the fact you can't pay your partners anymore, you can't pay out salaries, you can't pay your rent, which is opening us up for a lot of liabilities also. I think we need to be clear about that. NGOs have a lot of even just legal requirements in the countries where we're present, so this is a big risk for us. But especially for the type of work that we do, a lot of our work is built on trust, and it's built on acceptance, and it's built on the fact that we need to be able to speak with everybody and have access to all types of governments, but also armed groups and stuff like that.
Could you give me a concrete example of what that looks like?
We've had to absolutely hold from one day to another an activity we were holding in Lebanon, where there's a lot of tensions between local youth and security forces. We were just about to bring them together in a workshop. People were on a bus, we had to call them and we had to tell them, you have to go back home.
Wow.
So the fact that we had to break that down is going to take months before we can possibly take that back up again. And in the meantime, the trust has been broken, right? So there's a lot of work that we're almost going to have to start from scratch.
Yes, I was just talking to a humanitarian worker in the East Democratic Republic of Congo. There, a ceasefire was interrupted by the offense of a group of rebels backed by Rwanda, M23, who brought the count of casualties up to 3,000 at the time of recording. Despite how critical the situation is, staff of that organization that now wants to be kept anonymous had to be evacuated amidst worries about funds freeze.
And another very concrete example, because you were citing DR Congo. DR Congo is one of those places, especially with everything that's going on now in the East, where access to information is very crucial. It's almost life-saving in this moment. And so we've had, for a long time, a very large network of community radio stations that we work with to make sure that people have access to information, that there's also that there's no hate speech or like discriminatory speech against other groups being circulated on the local radio stations. And also that type of work has had to be put on hold immediately.
And just for our listeners to understand, can you give us a ballpark number or an idea of how important U.S. aid is for your activity, especially in Africa, for instance?
For our organization, we've always very much invested in having very diverse donors. So we're trying never to be openly dependent on only one, which kind of protects us now. There's other organizations that are in much deeper crisis mode, but it is hitting everything because there's a ripple effect in a way. Because many of our programs, the way that we run them, we have take a country like Mali, we'll have funding from the US government, we have funding from the EU, we have funding from the Dutch government, so we have a portfolio. If you need to all of a sudden shut one down, it has an impact on your entire team, it has an impact on your entire program. And I would say it goes beyond that, right? In countries that are heavily aid dependent still, and where, for example, places like Kenya or Jordan, where there's so much money that even for the government side depends on these donors bringing in the support that they give. If you shut that down from one day to another, you're going to get a situation where there's going to be social unrest, right? And I want to make a side remark there. We are not saying that there should never be any review of the aid that's being channeled, right? I think that there's a lot that can be said about reforms of the systems, about efficiencies. So all of that is fine, but it's the way this has been done and the way this has been imposed from one day to another that's absolutely detrimental.
Responding to critics, Trump claimed that all humanitarian and emergency activities will be funded and should resume. However, it's not that easy necessarily. Right. NGOs now have to prove that at least a part of their budget is strictly devolved to emergency operations. Is that something that you're dealing with as well as Search for Common Ground? Are you in negotiations with USAID, as I've heard from other NGOs?
So the one thing that is like front of mind for the Trump administration now is that they're looking at every program through the lens of, is it making America greater again, right? And they look at three criteria. Is it making America safer, stronger, and more prosperous?
But NGOs' focus is not necessarily to make America great again. They're independent.
Exactly. Our main purpose is to make the life of the communities that we work in better, right? So that's a very different angle. I think the process difficulty that we're going to see here, all programs will be reviewed now, and they've given the timeline of 90 days for the review, so 3 months. We are planning that there will be very many delays because if at the same time so many USAID employees have been put on hold or called back or put on administrative leave, there's very few people left who can actually do these reviews, right? I saw a figure just this morning that out of the staff for USAID remaining in Africa, I think they had about 1,400 people or something across the continent. There's going to be 12 remaining by the end of this month. So
that means only 1% of personnel will be left in the region.
You can imagine the workload on those people to then do the reviews. I think it will take a very long time.
Are you expecting things to change after these 90 days, especially if we think of these delays? First of all, how are these delays going to impact NGOs on the ground? And then what can you expect moving forward?
I think it's going to have a very big impact on the sector. And I speak development, I speak humanitarian, I speak peace building. I think we will unfortunately see several very large NGOs, but also very, very many small local organizations who won't necessarily survive this. I think it's that dire. I do not count on a scenario where all programs are going to get reapproved. Because just politically and ideologically, what the U.S. Trump administration is looking for, I think there's many programs where they consider it's no longer a priority.
For instance, are you thinking of any specific countries where that could happen?
I think it's about specific countries that we have concerns about, right? But I think it's also about certain types of programming. I think you need to look here at, I think there's an overlapping happening between, there was the executive order on foreign aid freezing, but there was an executive order on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. There was also an executive order on gender ideology. So if you look at through all those lenses, I think it's quite clear what type of programs that won't be a priority anymore.
Because if you look at the waste and abuse that has run through USAID over the past several years, these are some of the insane priorities that organization has been spending money on. $1.5 million to advance DEI in Serbia's workplaces, $70,000 for a production of a DEI musical in Ireland, $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia, $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru. I don't know about you, but as an American taxpayer, I don't want my dollars going towards this crap, and I know the American people don't either, and that's exactly what Elon Musk has been tasked by President Trump to do.
And are you in touch with EU officials about all this?
We've been in touch and we've been in talks with EU officials, but firstly, to help them understand what's happening, right? Because there's been a whole lot of information that's been coming out of the Trump administration in a short period of time, sometimes contradictory, sometimes inconsistent. And so we're trying to just help Europeans to get the facts straight, right? And also help them understand, what does this have as immediate impact? The fact that we can no longer pay salaries and stuff like that, all of that we're trying to explain. We're trying to help them understand how it could potentially impact what they're funding as well, right? If they're funding a particular NGO in a particular country and that NGO loses 40 or 50% of its income because of this, it will have an impact. So to help them understand that.
And do you reckon that having an impact assessment on the table could push Brussels to increase its funding?
There's nothing in my mind that has an expectation that the EU will be able to fill that vacuum, right? As we said, the pure amounts that we're talking about are so big that cannot be the expectation. But I do think that the Europeans need to be strategic and look especially for some of the regions that are more important, if I can say it like that, for the EU than the US. Because of different interests, I think there must be a willingness to step up there in those particular moments. Yeah, absolutely.
Are you thinking of Ukraine? Are you thinking of the Middle East?
I'm thinking about Sahel. I'm thinking about Middle East, indeed, some of those places. Some places perhaps in Africa where the EU has had or certain member states have had a longer standing presence. The whole aid sector, we just need to grab the reality that there is a diminishing ODA.
That stands for Official Development Assistance.
Even if we heavily disagree with it, I can say for our sector, if you just look at the figures, there's an all-time low in terms of investment in peace building, whereas the number of armed conflicts isn't at an all-time high, right? So there's definitely a discrepancy there.
And again, forgive me for this question, but something that I remember back from my days at university was, international development aid does not always work. Mm-hmm. Actually, there's a lot of cases where it leads to more corruption. Yeah. We don't see necessarily a direct correlation between aid and improvement in peace building or democracy. So why should states keep funding NGOs?
It's NGOs, but there's a lot of other actors active in the sector, right? There's a lot of UN agencies. There's the bilateral agencies of EU member states. So the foreign aid sector is composed of many different actors, I would say. And of course, international aid is not the panacea to every single problem in the world. I want to make that very clear. For that, you need to look at much bigger systems. There's investment needed in taxation, but also in debt relief. So we're talking about a much more microeconomic solutions. That said, you will always have, in several countries, the need for organizations that can access where others cannot have access, that can work with local populations, and that can really listen to the needs of those populations in ways that no budgetary support, for example, will be able to do, right?
For example?
So we've been working in Palestine for a long time and also inside Israel, right? We're one of the few organizations that actually works in both society and try to bring people together from both societies. We had just started out a new program that is funded by the US government, where we were bringing women on both sides together in what we call a track 2 dialogue process, where we were working with both groups of women bilaterally first, and then we were going to start bringing them together in a bridge building exercise with the idea of eventually preparing these women to take part in peace talks, whatever form and shape that would take. That is a very concrete thing that has now to be put on hold. So I think it's an and story. I think that there's definitely a lot of questions mark, and we need to have a serious and frank conversation about the added value. But I definitely still see a role for NGOs and the wider foreign aid sector.
Thank you, Hilde.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
To know more about the EU's role in global development assistance, I'm joined in the studio by Euractiv's politics reporter Magnus Lund Nielsen. Hello, Magnus.
Hi, Jara.
So one of the Trump administration's first move was to freeze all funding to the agency that distributes U.S. emergency and development aid all over the world. How bad is it for European NGOs?
We actually don't know yet. So one thing that should be clear is that the EU and Brussels-based NGOs and civil society is mainly funded by either EU institutions or member states. That's where they get their public money from. But we are still in undiscovered land currently because we don't know whether the loss of access to US funds might actually lead to a kind of a double whammy.
Yeah.
Because the EU, when they do these funding agreements with civil society organizations, they often do this in what's called multi-donor action, which means that the civil society organizations' access to EU funds is contingent on US funds, or at least funds coming from elsewhere. And so if they lose the access to US funds, they might also actually risk losing access to EU funds. We've been trying to hunt down the Commission over the past couple of days, finding out what's going to happen. And the honest answer I've gotten from the Commission so far is that they actually don't really know.
Indeed, I was just talking to a humanitarian worker in the DRC who told me that they got a request from ECHO to clarify whether they would be able to indeed deliver on the project that they had pitched. They said yes. For context, the U.S. is the world's largest source of foreign assistance. How does the EU's role in international development measure compared to that?
Well, if you ask the kind people across the street from where we're sitting in the Berlaymont building, they'll say, well, actually, Jara, you're wrong, because the EU is the biggest contributor. And that's because the EU counts itself, meaning the EU institution, as well as the member states, into one big basket. And if you're doing that, then actually the EU as such becomes the biggest contributor. I think if the numbers on top of my head is that the US provides about $65 billion in foreign aid, and the EU plus member states combined provides around $75 billion. So the EU has them by a tiny margin there.
I'm wondering if we think of the member states that are the largest contributors to humanitarian aid, we have Germany. According to EOCD data, they are the second biggest provider of official development assistance right after the US. Do you think the situation is putting pressure on Germany?
Yes and no. I mean, the thing is that already a few days ago, we heard of plans in Germany to cut their foreign aid spending, which is obviously adding to the panic here in Brussels. The French are also floating the same ideas in their current budget that just survived the vote.
And I'm interested in understanding where the rationale for this cut to funding comes from in Europe. Is it the influence of Donald Trump? Is it the rise of a certain political ideology? Or is it because we're looking inward rather than outwards?
I think there's a lot of different things at play here. We are currently covering how civil society organizations and NGOs and the whole question of their funding has been questioned in Brussels in recent days, especially in the European Parliament, where some center-right and right-wing lawmakers are questioning why EU funds are going to fund civil society organizations who then feed lobbying back into the EU system.
Well, or advocacy, or some call
or
it.
advocacy, some people would call it. And at the same time, it's also, to make the counterpoint, it's mentioned, I believe, 4 times combined in the EU treaties, both the functioning of the EU treaty and treaty of the EU, that civil society is a key member, and it's a prerogative of the EU to keep conversations alive. So as part of that, you could also argue that it's also a prerogative of the EU to fund said civil society.
So why else are we seeing this happen right now?
I guess it's also having to do with this liberal world order that we've been maybe a bit accustomed to, and at least that maybe especially EU officials and member states have been betting on for a few decades now, are slightly eroding, and we're approaching this more sort of realist era. And a part of that is also probably acknowledging that if you want to deal with other state actors, it's actually not necessarily super beneficial that you have all these civil societies talking about human rights and climate and environmental impact and whatever. And that could be the slightly more conspiracy theorist reading of what's happening.
Does it have to do with the state of the economy as well?
Surely. I mean, we are having to make tough choices all around. I would say, though, that the spending on development aid across the board is a fraction of both the EU budget, of member states' budgets as well.
And so, seeing the situation right now, I was just talking to Hilde Deman, who explained very clearly how the cutting of funding to NGOs could lead to political instability, could lead to further divisions across communities. Will the EU step up its own contributions, according to the sources that you've talked to?
We got a statement from a Commission spokesperson a few days ago that stated that, well, the EU remains steadfast to its dedication to foreign aid and wants to, let's say, perceive its role as a huge actor globally in this regard.
It's funny that you mentioned this because we reached out to the Commission for a comment as well. And the only thing they did was redirect us to that exact spokes comment from a midday briefing.
We have taken note of the announcement made by President Trump to temporarily suspend all U.S. foreign assistance programs for 90 days. As the biggest donor for development aid in the world, the EU and its member states continue their efforts in addressing poverty and advancing global development. We are committed to accelerating progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals beyond our borders.
I dare say as much that it's probably not going to be able to fill the gap that's going to be left by U.S. foreign aid, if that's going to be cut off more permanently than this 90 days notice we're currently working with.
Thank you, Magnus.
Thank you, Jada.
This was Euractiv's podcast, Today in the EU. Sound design by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, research and production by Charles Cohen. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news and sign up for our newsletters. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and your favorite streaming platforms. Don't forget to subscribe and give us a review. It will really help us spread the word about our work. See you tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.